Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law Dissemination Program here at National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., I want to welcome you to our fourth anniversary Ukraine-russo War Legal Reflection webinar. I'm Thomas Harper. I serve as Senior Counsel in IHL for the American Red Cross, and it's my pleasure to be with you here today. It's a little alarming that an entire 4 years has passed since the outbreak of the latest component of the war between Russia and Ukraine. I say the latest component because if you've been keeping up with the region, you know that conflict has been going on there, extending back many years before 2022. But February 24th of 2022 marked a defining moment in the escalation and changing character of that armed conflict as Russian forces invaded Ukraine wholesale. This is what it looked like in February of 2022 as Russian forces poured across most of Ukrainian borders to the east and north, in addition to the south around Crimea. And fast forwarding 4 years, the lay of the land looks substantially different than it did in those first few days of the war. This is a map from 2 years ago this time. And you see in red there the areas of Russian controlled territory in Ukraine, to include Crimea down in the south. And if we compare that to the overall map from just a day or so ago, it looks like not a ton has changed. This war has been characterized by its grinding nature up to this point, after the initial fighting from the first few months settled down and both sides sort of settled into the current territories that they fight over as we speak. There's been some changes along those borders. Obviously, there's been an evolution, as there is in any armed conflict, some subtle shifts, but overall, a remarkable sort of status quo in 2 years' time, and certainly in 4 years' time, if you track back to the beginning of the conflict. The numbers concerning the conflict are staggering, and this is only a few. Over 100,000 Ukrainian armed forces soldiers killed in action, more than 300,000 Russian forces killed in action. Those figures don't include wounded on both sides, and understandably, all of these figures are just estimates, as best as can be gleaned from different sources. More than 18,000 Ukrainian civilians killed, and that doesn't include Russian civilians as well. And then more than 1 million plus total wounded service members on both sides of the conflict. Absolutely staggering. And to put it into context a bit, with sort of a high watermark armed conflict in history, here's just the combat deaths from three nations in World War II: Great Britain, France, and the United States. You can already see that the combined military death total of both sides has already eclipsed all three of these nations, major players in World War II. So you're approaching levels of casualties, if not in some ways eclipsing them, to figures that were last reached in World War II. And we think of that conflict in a much different light. That you think about World War II, even though most of us, if not all of us, weren't around when that conflict was being fought, it seems all encompassing. I mean, every aspect of society was affected by it. Nations across the globe were drawn into it. The Ukraine-russo conflict just isn't seen through the same light. And yet, the casualty totals, the suffering that has been wrought by the conflict, is statistically comparable now, which is just a really sobering statistic. So let's set the stage, because what we're going to do here today is unpack a few aspects of the conflict that have become sort of defining aspects of it over the last 4 years. We'll look at IHL implications in it, but to do that, we have to properly set the table. And to start, for those that are unfamiliar with international humanitarian law, what we're talking about here is a subset of international law that's synonymous with the law of armed conflict. It's also been known as the law of war. But what this is a subset of rules. It's there to limit the destructive effects of armed conflict. So it's not a set of rules that's there to inhibit military forces or make it harder to achieve your side's objectives. It's not a subset of law that has any concern over why you went to war, the legality or illegality of your overall action in choosing to go to war, who's right and who's wrong in that regard. IHL is concerned with what's happening and the legality of it once the fighting starts. And as IHL has developed over decades and centuries, there has been a central through line, and that is that the suffering that is inherent in armed conflict affects anyone, no matter your race, your ethnicity, your political affiliation, your national identity, the reasons why, or the justness of, or lack thereof, of your rationale for going to war. It affects everyone. Most especially civilians, those non-combatants who are simply caught in harm's way through no fault of their own. That suffering has been the through line. And what IHL, as a body of law, attempts to do is work to limit that suffering as best as possible, as best as a body of laws can. And so what it is not a set of handcuffs, as has sometimes been used to describe IHL by folks that view it through a political lens, but it's a fulcrum. It attempts to strike a compromise on one hand between the interests and realities of military necessity, the notion, the reality that certain things are necessary within an armed conflict to end it, to achieve peace at the end. One side or the other is going to have to destroy things. People are going to get killed and injured during an armed conflict. All of that is inescapable. To deny that requirement of military necessity would be to render IHL an unworkable body of law. No one would follow it. No one would sign on to the treaties that comprise its backbone. It just wouldn't be workable in real life. So you balance that reality on one side, and on the other side of the scales is the interest of humanity. And I say humanity as a whole because IHL is concerned not only with the innocent who are involved or caught up in armed conflict, civilians say, but also the combatants themselves. You don't forfeit or put your humanity on pause, your need for humane treatment on pause, simply because you take up arms and choose to participate or are forced to participate in armed conflict. And again, that's a cross-cutting interest that is without regard to any of those sort of individualized, politicized, polarizing aspects of humanity. So IHL sits in the middle as a fulcrum, attempting to balance the two. It doesn't do a perfect job. Those two sides will never be equal as they're shown on this slide here. But without that fulcrum in the middle, without an attempt to balance the interests of humanity against military necessity, really the only question in a conflict becomes what's militarily necessary. And that's been the case in many wars going back millennia. You could use the idea that something was necessary militarily to justify just about anything. It was a massive trapdoor through which you could justify just about any action, no matter how horrendous. So IHL attempts to be that fulcrum in the middle. And while it will never get that balance exactly equal, it's critical that it remain there in that role. And so with that, before we dive into specific issues in IHL, it's appropriate to frame this conflict because how this conflict is classified matters. Not every conflict is classified the same. Not every conflict is created the same. You have two types, international and non-international armed conflicts. And in the eyes of IHL, they're not the same. An international armed conflict is as sort of the classic type of war that we think of when we think of an armed conflict. And it's pretty straightforward in its composition. It involves two or more states, countries, nations, and a resort to the use of armed force. Now, what that level of armed force is not precisely defined. There's no mathematical definition in IHL of what where that bar sits. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, our partner in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, would say that the bar for use of the armed force, that threshold, is very low. It can be an exchange of gunfire, for instance. It doesn't need to be a massive military campaign involving air and land assets. What's important here is that an IAC, as we call it, does not require a declaration of war. When we say the term war, that's really at its base a political word. It carries the connotation that is most often accompanied by a requirement that some political machinery move. A declaration happened, one state declares war on another. That sort of thing just doesn't happen anymore. You don't see states get into the business of going before whatever their legislative body is and issuing a declaration of war. Most recently, just within the last 2 weeks of this recording, you saw a declaration of a state of war on Twitter or X between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, the business of this classical idea of a leader of a nation going before a legislative body, the Roosevelt going before Congress and decrying Pearl Harbor and moving to declare war against the Axis powers in World War II. That doesn't happen anymore. The reason for this classification isn't to try to enter into some academic exercise. The reason this matters is because it affects when IHL is triggered and what components of IHL are triggered. That's really critical because IHL as a body of law isn't in action at all times. It's only triggered when there's the presence of an armed conflict. And so for an IAC, you need these two things and these two things alone to trigger or enter into that sort of armed conflict and therefore trigger IHL. So it's a low threshold. It's very easy to establish. And in an IAC, all of IHL is triggered. Common Article 2 to the Geneva Conventions, the full application of all 4 Geneva Conventions, and a host of other aspects of IHL, not the least of which is customary international law. So those are the rules that apply during an IAC. So it's really critical that you, A, figure out when an armed conflict starts, and B, what kind of armed conflict it is so that you can determine what components of IHL apply. So here in Ukraine, it's pretty easy to determine when that armed conflict was triggered. I think you can make an argument that IHL was triggered going back to the invasion of Crimea circa 2014. But classically, just in the current state of the armed conflict, it's that February 24th invasion as Russian forces crossed over and engaged in the use of force against Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian government. That's the trigger point. IHL applies, and because it's two nations, Ukraine and Russia, fighting one another, you have the full body of IHL triggered. So keep that in mind as you consider and absorb IHL stories or news stories about Ukraine. Let's dig into some components of the conflict that have evolved over the last 4 years and their sort of IHL implications. The first of which is drone warfare. There's perhaps no more defining aspect of the Ukraine-Russia war than the increasing and incredibly prevalent use of unmanned drones.
Extraordinary footage of the fates, two different fates of soldiers on the front line. A Ukrainian saved by a drone, extraordinarily, but also a Russian commander abandoned, it seems, by his unit, declared dead in Russia, yet surviving and receiving Ukrainian care. Here's the story. It is usually only the dead lying here, in the craters of Ukraine's southern front, but sometimes a glint of life shines. This drone spotting a Ukrainian soldier, Sergei, separated from his unit. Wounded in the chest and leg by shelling, he filmed this as he lay alone, bleeding. He feared whatever fight to live he put up would not be enough, he later told CNN from his hospital bed.
I was ready to fight for my life, and I did, even lying there under the blazing sun. I realized I was too close to the Russians, and you even start to look at your gun in a different way.
But the drone operators had other plans. They attached water, medicine and a note to the drone and sent it back. It found him again and dropped the package. But he didn't know if it was friendly or a Russian bomb.
All the time I was crawling, a drone was always hovering above. We didn't realize if it was friend or foe. It was a lottery.
This is the moment he realizes the drone may save him. The water and medicine kept coming, easing the pain that was visible even from up high, and then he crawled back to safety.
The combat medics who gave me first aid when they found me were very surprised I survived for 2 days with a pierced lung.
Sergei's recovering and talks now of a new life with greater value and purpose. They don't want to leave anyone behind, said the drone operator.
I mentioned the prevalence of drones during the conflict, and the numbers bear that out. In 2025 alone, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense attributed 80% of Ukrainian armed forces strikes to the usage of drones. From both sides, more than 1.5 million targets were struck in 2025 alone by drones. And between Russia and Ukraine, their domestic production of drones, you're talking production in excess of 3 million drones annually. That production has substantially ramped up over the past just 3 years of the conflict. If you cycle back to year one of the conflict, Ukraine had very little, if any, domestic drone manufacture capability. That has since substantially changed. And these numbers bear out the outsized role that drones are playing in this conflict. Drones come in a variety of type. I think sometimes in the U.S. we're used to seeing things like the larger Predator drones of the war on terror. Drones have come a long way, and here are just a few examples. The drone on the left, the Molniya drone, this is a plywood drone that is very prevalent amongst Russian forces. It is extremely cheap to produce. Again, its wings and tail fin, those are all made of plywood. The quadcopter on the right there has a unique aspect. Quadcopters are probably the most prevalent platform of drone in this conflict. But what's unique about this is that canister down underneath it. That fiber optic cable canister is a more recent development in the conflict. You'll see just miles and miles of this fiber optic cable that looks like spider webs that have been spun all across battlefields in Ukraine. And this fiber optic cable is being used to counter the counter drone technology that's out there to keep these drones operational in the face of counter or consistently evolving counter drone technology. Early in the war and continuing to this day, these quadcopters provided or manufactured, I should say, by a Chinese company named DJI are extraordinarily prevalent. FPV means first person first person view. So in other words, an operator is wearing either a set of virtual reality goggles or is operating a remote like the one you see on the left there. They're viewing the world through the lens of the camera on the drone. DJI, as of today, has something like a 70% market share of commercial drones across the world. Keep in mind that these are civilian off-the-shelf drones. You can buy these yourself. Yet, pretty rapidly, as the war broke out, these were honed in on as a cheap, cost-effective way to accomplish a range of goals on the battlefield, be it reconnaissance, attack, or other means. Larger quadcopters have also become very prevalent. So those small DJIs have a limited range and a limited battery life. There's some modifications that you can make to extend that out, but they're sort of inherently limited. They also have a limited payload capacity. The amount that they can carry is limited based on the modest power that they have. Larger quadcopters or hexacopters solve that problem. They're able to go farther, carry a higher capacity battery, carry larger munitions or more advanced optics, that sort of thing. And these aren't necessarily military specific drones either. You can go across farmlands in the United States and you will see drones of this caliber operating, spraying crops, doing all sorts of labor in place of human operators out or human farm hands. They've just been repurposed here for this conflict. And then you have an entire range of fixed wing drones that continue to be developed. Here's the Jiran 2. This is a Russian built UAV that is based on an Iranian Shahed type drone. These are either operated by prop, so a propeller in the back, or a more advanced version has a jet propulsion. These have longer range, again, higher payload, and oftentimes these are steered directly into targets as suicide drones, kamikaze drones. One way they crash right into their target and detonate their payload. Think for a moment, and obviously there's a scale here, but think for a moment about the small end of the drones that I just laid out. The average DJI drone, this or generic commercial off-the-shelf drone, you're talking about a cost of somewhere between 400 to 3,000 US dollars to buy one of these. That's no small bit of pocket change for the average person. But when you compare it to traditional military equipment, say a Russian helicopter at a cost of over $15 million per unit, you can quickly see the why the drones like this have become so prevalent. In a world in which every piece of military equipment, the large size equipment, costs an exorbitant amount, the ability to put quadcopters or other drones into action at scale at a much more cost-effective measure means is obviously attractive. Both sides have leaned heavily into the drone world because of this exact fact, just the natural economy of armed conflict. And so that's driven the prevalence of these drones. It's also significant that a small, very cheap drone like this can severely damage or destroy a much more expensive piece of military equipment like this helicopter. And so you can quickly see that there's sort of an economic side to armed conflict. As losses pile up, both in casualties, those losses also constitute a dollar figure that becomes unsustainable at a certain point for a party to bear. Or unsustainable for them to regenerate. And so these drones are being used in a wide variety of fashion. Probably the most prevalent are military strikes. So whether it's kamikaze type drones carrying munitions that they drop onto targets, this is a highly effective sort of battlefield redefining way that hardware is being used. Reconnaissance is a key capability, both to just observe the battlefield, but also to guide in other offensive means of attack. So, for example, a drone being used to spot for artillery, so to guide in artillery fire to make it more accurate, very common usage.
This is recent footage of a DJI Agras drone, which was designed for agricultural purposes and is able to lift 120 kilograms. Here it is practicing the evacuation of a wounded Russian soldier from a minefield. But there is another much smaller DJI.
So the casualty aid bit is fascinating to me because just 5 years ago, the concept of a quadcopter drone evacuating a casualty on a battlefield, unheard of. Just wasn't considered. I mean, if you told that to somebody, they would chalk that up as science fiction. And yet now a drone like that, designed at base for agricultural use, is being used as a much more cost-effective way to get casualties off the battlefield. Drones are also playing a key role in capturing combatants. Again, one of these notions that if you teed this up, the idea of soldiers surrendering to a drone 5, 6, 10 years ago, it would have been chalked up as fiction. And yet this is commonplace now. That image in particular, those are Russian soldiers surrendering. This was just from a few weeks ago. They were surrendering to a ground-based unmanned drone operated by Ukrainian forces, something that looked a little like this. It's objectively terrifying, right? Drones and their usage, their design have rapidly increased. So there you have a video of a Russian soldier surrendering to a drone. Notice there are no Ukrainian forces in the immediate vicinity. He's surrendering to a drone. Those explosions you saw around him, those are rounds from his own soldiers, his own forces attempting to kill him as he attempted to surrender. We'll come back to his case, but again, just an extraordinary set of circumstances and just a visual indicator of just how far this technology has evolved in 4 short years, but also the use of that and implementation on the battlefield of that technology. What you won't find if you crack open any component of IHL, we'll take the Geneva Conventions of 1949 as an example. What you won't find is any text, any protective articles in there that concern drones. The word drone isn't going to be found in the Geneva Conventions anywhere. They didn't exist in 1949, not in any capacity, maybe outside of a fiction novel. And yet, these core components of IHL apply undoubtedly to drones and their, however they evolve from here in 2026. And that's because the baseline principle that the drafters of, say, the Geneva Conventions built in was this notion that weapons and tactics, the ways in which those weapons are used, the ways in which you engage in warfare, collectively that has to comply with IHL. So you see IHL being applied, IHL that was written, at least in the case of these treaties, some 75 years ago, being applied on a modern battlefield to technology that was probably beyond the scope of imagination when these treaties were written. And yet there's an enduring applicability of these treaties to even the most modern of battlefield advances because of how they were written. So IHL lays down this general rule that however you're fighting, weapons, the tactics, the means, methods, those ways or technologies have to comply with IHL. And so what's incumbent amongst to drone operators, to parties such as Ukraine and Russia employing these drones or developing these drones, is that they stay true to this principle. So basic core principles of IHL like distinction, proportionality, military necessity, those are all applicable, even if you're talking about a super advanced piece of 21st century technology. And we stand, as this presentation is being given, really on the precipice of the next leap forward in this technology. Right now, what you are not seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine is much of any, certainly not widespread use of AI-driven drones, fully autonomous drones on the battlefield. And by that, I mean drones that are capable of operating without a human being in the loop, capable of fully autonomously identifying, selecting, and engaging targets. That is changing. The push to incorporate AI into drones is happening as we speak. Both sides are rapidly experimenting and trying to find ways to train AI, to incorporate AI onto these platforms in an economical way, and a way that preserves some of the tactical advantages of drones, say their small form factor. So you see an example here that's laid out by CSIS, a Washington-based think tank, and you see this method of adapting AI or putting AI onto a small quadcopter drone that comes in the form of a small chip and a small module that go together and fit onto a drone. So you're able to save that small factor that makes a drone so effective, and yet potentially equip it with what it needs to operate without a human being in the loop.
Artificial intelligence is a growing presence in drone warfare technology. It could dominate its future. Skyton has developed an onboard AI system so that Raybird can identify targets by itself. No need for an operator to be glued to the screen for hours on end, with potential loss of concentration. The latest Raybird is also the first to be armed with a bomb. Man will literally be taken out of the equation in this very 21st century hunter-killer machine.
So that's a Ukrainian-built drone and a Ukrainian domestic drone manufacturer that's actively working on, in that case, AI capabilities for one of its in-house designed fixed-wing drones. This is happening as we speak, and both nations have a vested interest in pursuing this technology because manpower is, in many regards, a finite resource. Certainly for Ukraine, it's a more pressing resource as the country with the smaller population of the two. If you can find a way to incorporate AI in a way that saves personnel to be able to do other things, that saves personnel from having to operate as drone operators closer to the front lines where they're at risk, there's a certain cost savings there that is very attractive to an entity fighting. But it raises some serious questions when it comes to complying with that base level rule. Chief among them is, what are you using the drone for? What are you authorizing or enabling, empowering AI to do when operating that drone? Is it simple reconnaissance, simply going out, operating a drone in a particular pattern or over a geographical area, collecting video, sending that back for use by human operators or human service members? Or are you sending that drone out there to be able to independently and without a human target, identify military targets, and then use force against those targets with onboard munitions? Those are two very, very different sets of missions and two very, very different sets of questions. It's one thing to have an autonomously operating drone that's flying around and collecting data. It's another question entirely under IHL for that device to be using lethal force against targets that it selects on its own. Human intervention is another huge question. The real key defining feature of a fully autonomous weapon system is the lack of a human in the loop. As these systems are developed and implemented, what, if any, human involvement with it will there be? Will a human be there to validate a targeting decision? Will a human be there to provide, or as a necessity, give a green light to the use of force? Will a human be there to input the data set that's used to define what the enemy target is, or what kind of enemy targets the AI model is looking for? Are we looking for armored vehicles, uniformed soldiers, etc.? That's a massive question. It's one that permeates AI inclusion and technology in our domestic lives as well. Think about the average robot taxi. The idea of a car, a deadly vehicle, right, can cause a lot of damage if it's not operated correctly or safely, driving around in your city on its own, picking up passengers and taking them around. The question of whether a human is involved in that process, whether a human can step in and stop a vehicle from doing something unsafe, to move it to a safer place, say if it's blocking traffic for emergency vehicles. I mean, those same questions are in play domestically as AI is introduced in other capacities in our world. And so because of the stakes in armed conflict, because of the boundaries that IHL places on the use of force, it's of heightened importance. Error rate is another key question. We're all familiar with the concept of AI making errors, hallucinating data, confidently coming up with an answer that's just completely off base to whatever the truth behind the question is. What happens when AI is empowered or put into use on the battlefield? What if it's wrong? When it tries to identify someone? What if a soldier is attempting to surrender and the AI model doesn't correctly identify that? What is that error rate? And we would certainly consider an error rate in other aspects of means and methods of warfare. Take smart munitions, for example. There's a known error rate for just about every kind of smart munition we talk about. When we talk about cluster munitions, and the business of whether those cluster munitions dud out and remain inert or dangerous for long periods of time after the cluster munition explodes, those are considered, and those error rates are considered in other aspects. It's certainly a key consideration here. How sure can we be of an AI model, something that's put onto a microchip and loaded on a quadcopter, that it's going to get it right? And if it gets it wrong, who's responsible? If there's no human in the loop, at what level, where do you go when it comes to accountability? Who has to answer for that error, be it a deliberate error or otherwise? I don't have the answer. I don't profess to have the answer to these questions, but these are going to permeate the advancement, and they're going to dog the development of this technology. But I will tell you that just judging by the pace of advancement in this conflict alone, this single conflict in 4 years, it's not going to slow or stop the development or the desire to implement this technology. But these questions like this and more are going to have to be reckoned with for these weapons to be able to lawfully be implemented and used on the battlefield. Let's talk about personnel on the battlefield. One of the defining characteristics of this conflict, are the varying personnel on the Ukrainian battlefield. Individuals like these militia members, mercenaries, or alleged mercenaries. It's a separate question whether they meet the legal definition of mercenary. But the Wagner Group made headlines for quite a while in 2022 and 2023. Foreign fighters. These are U.S. citizens who have joined the fight as part of this group called Rogue in Ukraine. More recently, foreign fighters, members of foreign militaries, such as these North Koreans. Gone are the days where, and I don't know if they ever existed, where a battlefield is only occupied by members of the military on both sides. A modern battlefield like Ukraine is proliferated by many different types of people, many different types of combatants. Understand that under IHL, there are two classes of individuals on the battlefield: civilians and combatants. The distinction is critical because for civilians, they're protected against direct attack. You can't intentionally target civilians. Obviously, a civilian can lose that protected status, but at base, they're protected against that direct attack. Combatants, on the other hand, well, they're not protected against direct attack. You can target a combatant at any time. You don't have to question what they're doing. They could be in the rear cooking lunch. They could be on the front line in a trench actively fighting. As long as they're a combatant, they're not protected against that direct attack. So the distinction between those classes really matters. And these are the two buckets that IHL puts individuals in. Another critical component of these two categories is their legal ability to operate on the battlefield. Combatants have what's called combatant immunity. That is legal immunity to kill on the battlefield. That has to be done within the bounds of IHL, but IHL recognizes that combatants, by necessity, have to kill other combatants, an act that under normal circumstances would be a crime in domestic law. To preserve and recognize that military necessity, that's where that combatant immunity comes into place, so that combatants don't come home or exit a conflict and get prosecuted for just the normal course of action, the normal things that combatants are asked to do. On the other hand, civilians don't have that combatant immunity. If a civilian is taking up arms and directly participating in hostilities, well, they're doing so at great legal risk because they will be exposed to or they can be exposed to legal accountability for that. Additionally, when individuals are captured, combatants are able, at least in the context of an international armed conflict, to be treated as prisoners of war, which we'll get to momentarily, whereas civilians are not. When combatants go outside the rules, when they are operating in ways that violate IHL, they lose that combatant immunity. One of the earliest domestic prosecutions in the Ukraine war, one that happened in July of 2022 in Ukraine, involved this gentleman here, a Russian private, low-ranking Russian soldier, Igor Shishmarin. He was prosecuted for and pled guilty to killing a Ukrainian civilian in the early days of the initial invasion. Again, that prosecution was only possible, and by that I mean to get around that combatant immunity, because prosecutors had alleged that Shishmarin had violated IHL. So you don't get combatant immunity for breaking IHL, and that was at the center of his guilty plea. Now, combatants come in a few different forms. They could be armed forces of the party. They could be militia and volunteer groups that are part of the armed forces. They could be levée en masse. We won't dive into levée en masse, but that's the idea of a civilian population sort of spontaneously rising up to throw off an invading force. Let's tackle the armed forces of a party quickly. In this conflict, some of this consideration is easy. Members of the Ukrainian army, their navy, air force, etc., very clearly combatants. Likewise, members of the Russian military, very clearly combatants. But there's been some coloring of this within the conflict that causes you to question whether certain individuals fall into this category. What about North Korean forces? There's some estimate that between 10 and 12,000 North Korean soldiers are operating in Ukraine currently. Are they considered armed forces of a party? Ukraine, at least when these soldiers allegedly arrived in country circa 2024 into 2025, North Korea hadn't entered the conflict. North Korea hadn't, wasn't actively using force. They were supplying Russian forces with certain military materiel, but there was no other use of force between the country of North Korea and the country of Ukraine. Well, that changed as their soldiers hit the ground. And interestingly, as some of these soldiers were captured, Ukrainian forces made an interesting discovery. They were carrying fake Russian papers, fake Russian passports or identity papers that purported to identify them as Russians. There was an effort to conceal their status as North Koreans. And that goes directly back to that question of, is North Korea a party to the armed conflict here? Well, that's changed in the intervening months. Russia has confirmed that North Korean troops are fighting alongside its forces, and whether they are fighting as representatives of the North Korean army or they've been integrated into the Russian armed forces, operational tactical control of those armed forces, they fit the definition of combatants. No matter how you slice it, they are members of armed forces to a party to the conflict. Whether you can classify North Korea as being in an IAC against Ukraine is a separate question. But as far as these soldiers are concerned, they are combatants. They would get that combatant immunity. And certainly they are enjoying that prisoner of war status. That's such a critical suite of protections for combatants. Ukraine has been treating the handful of North Koreans that it's captured as prisoners of war. This article is just from a few days ago, and it remains an active and evolving issue. Now, what about militia and volunteer forces? So oftentimes, and Ukraine has been exemplary of this, you can have all sorts of groups fighting on a battlefield. Certainly the war on terror the U.S.'s experience in Afghanistan and Iraq was exemplary of this. You had any number of militias that were not affiliated with the government of either of those countries operating, fighting around Iraq and Afghanistan. That's been the case to some degree in Ukraine as well. But there's an interesting wrinkle here because as you see in the text there, not any militia, not any volunteer group is a combatant. They have to form part of the armed forces. That's a critical distinction point. Between forces like the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force, the Ukrainian International or Foreign Legion, Ukraine has taken steps time and again to incorporate many of these groups into its armed forces. It's done so through its legislative process. And that is because of a recognition of this requirement within the Geneva Conventions. Militias, volunteer groups, they don't get that protection. They don't get that combatant immunity. They don't get that combatant status or that POW protection without being formally integrated into the armed forces. So you saw very early on the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian military take steps to formalize those groups' membership in their armed forces. And yet that still remains controversial. The Russian forces don't universally recognize that membership. Elsewhere, for groups like the Wagner Group, this sort of notorious mercenary group that operates around, they're not integrated into the armed forces, in this case of the Russian military. They're brought in, fighting alongside or fighting under the command of a party to the armed conflict is not the same as forming part of the armed forces. So just because you're taking part in the same battle doesn't mean that you have this legal status. And that's the case with Wagner Group. The forces that were fighting in Bakhmut in 2023 in large numbers, they were never formally integrated into the Russian military. And IHL has its own definition of what is a mercenary. It's a 6-part test found in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention. And whether Wagner meets that 6-part test it's its own question that we won't get in here today. But it does not constitute, its members do not constitute combatants under this definition or this arm of what a combatant is under the Geneva Conventions. So what that means is if you're not operating as a combatant, you're operating as a civilian. So even though those fighters were fighting alongside Russian forces, they were uniformed in many cases, carrying weapons, doing all the things that a combatant would do, they don't have that legal status. And so that impacted their ability to lawfully fight It will impact their members' legal liability if any of them are captured and brought to trial, either during the war or after the war in any capacity. And it will certainly and is certainly impacting the protections that they're afforded if and when they're captured. So again, to drive this home, mercenaries do not have combatant status. There's not a separate category under IHL that covers mercenaries as having some special set of protections in IHL. They're treated as civilians. I mentioned captives, and prisoners of war continue to be a major topic within the war. When we look at the numbers of POWs on both sides, they're equally staggering to the figures that I put up earlier. More than 10,000 POWs are held. This statistic likely grossly underestimates the number of prisoners that are held because Russia and the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine, those breakaway governments, they don't routinely publicly report out on the number of prisoners of war that they hold. These are fed by estimates. Oftentimes, it's estimates that are driven by, in some cases, soldiers who are missing in action, presumed to be prisoners if they're not presumed to be dead. More than 4,000 of these POWs have been repatriated. That's released to one side or the other, and that's been effectuated through more than 60 prisoner swaps. Very recently, we had, after a several-month hiatus of prisoner swaps, you had a very recent one during the most recent round of talks. And these continue to be a beacon of hope for these prisoners on both sides. IHL doesn't require prisoner exchanges. This is a political sort of manifestation that often accompanies peace talks or other geopolitical exchanges between parties to an armed conflict. But it's reflective of the purpose, the intent behind this POW status. That's what it is. It's a legal status, as one that's not meant to be punitive. The whole point of a POW status is to keep soldiers off the battlefield from going back in and fighting. And so the law, as it's construed, is structured around that notion. You're not imprisoning them to punish them for fighting. You're imprisoning them to keep them off the battlefield. The Ukrainian government has stood up an entire element of its civilian government that's solely tasked with handling prisoners of war and their treatment. It's a fascinating website to dive into. You can turn on Google Translate and kind of poke around, but there's all sorts of resources there for family members, both of Ukrainian prisoners or missing Ukrainian soldiers, but also it's designed so that Russian family members of Russian soldiers can also go onto this site and find information, be able to track down their loved ones who might be held captive. And you see their statistic about number of returned prisoners. The legal framework will fly through because I realize we're close to the top of the hour. Understand that POW is a pretty broad definition. It's a combatant who falls into the hands of an adverse party in an IAC. POWs do not exist in non-international armed conflict. Doesn't mean you can't be detained, but this legal status only exists in an IAC. And so when it comes to falling into the hands, that can look like surrender. That can look like you're captured after being injured. Here's Private Nikolaevich, the individual that surrendered to that drone. He would meet the definition of a prisoner of war in that instance. As soon as he's surrendering to that drone, even though it's a piece of machinery that's guiding him back to Ukrainian forces, he has fallen into the hands of the opposing party. So he is a POW from that moment that he indicates a willingness and an intent to surrender. POWs come in multiple categories, and you see that across Ukraine. You can have a number of detained persons, some of whom are not considered POWs. You can have non-combatants, medical, religious personnel. They're considered retained persons, not prisoners of war. They're not classically considered prisoners of war. It's a sort of specialized substatus. Combatants are entitled to that prisoner of war status in an IAC, and then civilians can be detained as well, although they don't get that same suite of protections under it's laid out in GC3. who qualifies as a member of POW is a matter of categories. And these look a lot like the same categories from our combatant consideration. The caveat being that third one and fourth category are interesting in that these are arguably civilians. Persons accompanying the armed forces could be a military contractor, civilian contractor that's maybe providing food services on a military base, and they get captured. They are entitled to that POW status. Levee en masse, those by definition are civilians who happen to have taken up arms to repel an invasion. Those are also considered POWs if they're part of a levee en masse. To tie back into that mercenary talking point, mercenaries can be denied POW status since they're not combatants alongside the individuals on that right side. They are not entitled to the POW status. And interestingly, that last point, combatants who don't distinguish themselves, who don't follow the rules of IHL, they lose that ability to be considered a POW. So you break the rules, you lose that combatant immunity. You can also lose that POW status. I mentioned non-combatants, so that's your medical and religious personnel. We want them as retained persons so that they continue doing their specialized jobs, that religious service, those medical services, etc. The suite of protections for POWs under GC3 is extensive. The detaining power is responsible solely for providing those protections, regardless of any of their other responsibilities. It's not something that can be derogated or set aside. That includes respecting their combatant immunity, which means not prosecuting them for their lawful wartime acts, so things that fit within the bounds of IHL. That includes not forcing POWs to renounce their rights under GC3. You can't condition certain treatment on a renunciation of rights. They must be treated humanely. You can't subject them to violence, medical experimentation, intimidation, acts of public curiosity. So something like taking pictures of them and publishing them on the news, parading them around town, etc. They're entitled to free medical care for their wounds. And there's a requirement of equality of treatment and respect of honor, that latter category being really a sort of gender-oriented. There's a gender-oriented component there. We want POWs, regardless of their gender, et cetera, to be treated equally. And you can't conduct reprisals against POWs. So you can't retaliate, take revenge on POWs for things that the enemy is doing on the battlefield. You can question POWs, but again, interrogation has to be done within the bounds of the other protections listed in GC3. There have been numerous allegations on both sides of POW mistreatment, some incidents that have caught the headlines. This is the destruction of a POW facility that Russia controlled from 2023 that made headlines as numerous Ukrainian POWs were killed. Both sides alleged that the other was responsible, but POWs have really borne the brunt of a ton of violence and horrific treatment in this war. According to the UN and a study they did a couple of years ago, you see some just sobering statistics here in terms of reported mistreatment from POWs who've been repatriated. And that repatriation is a critical component of the POW status. I mentioned that POW as a status, it's not punitive. It's not a jail sentence to punish you for fighting. That notion is connected deeply to the requirement that POWs be repatriated as soon as possible after hostilities. Before hostilities conclude, parties have an obligation to repatriate the sick and incurably wounded and those who are permanently disabled. The idea here being that these folks pose little to no risk of returning to the battlefield. There is no legitimate purpose for holding them as POWs. After the cessation of hostilities, there's a requirement that POWs, all POWs, be released and repatriated without delay. So when this conflict ends, expect to see a large-scale repatriation of POWs from both sides, assuming that GC3 is being adhered to. For those of you who can stay on beyond the hour, you're welcome to. We'll cover this last category of battlefield justice and addressing alleged IHL violations. So the International Criminal Court has featured centrally in this conflict as it pertains to alleged IHL violations since the conflict broke out. And the scale of investigations is just as sobering as some of the other statistics that we've gone through today. Some 100,000+ alleged war crimes are under investigation by authorities, not just the ICC, but Ukrainian authorities as well. It's unclear how many IHL violations Russian authorities are investigating. They don't publicly report out on that I've been able to determine. But there are a staggering number of alleged violations that are in the pipeline being investigated. You think about the draw on resources that has, the demands on personnel power, on investigative tools, the dangers that are inherent in investigating those crimes, many of which have occurred at or near the front lines of this war. And underlying all of this is the question of who's got the ability to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute these crimes moving forward. And when it comes to the ICC, that's a central question. That's a starting point question, because for a court to be able to take action on a crime, it has to have jurisdiction. It has to have the ability to apply itself to that crime. It's a foundational element of jurisprudence, both domestically and internationally. The ICC has jurisdiction over 4 main crimes. Those include genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, and the crime of aggression. There's also a question of location. So you have to consider whether the alleged crime falls within one of those 4 buckets for the ICC to be able to investigate or have jurisdiction. But also the question of location of where the crime occurred is also important. When it comes to crimes that are committed within Ukraine, the ICC has a few options for its establishing jurisdiction. One is crimes that are committed inside a state party. I mean, a state party to the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute's what gave the ICC life, what constituted the court. And so if you're a state party to the Rome Statute and there's a crime committed in your jurisdiction, the ICC can latch on. If a crime is committed inside a state that's acceded to or adopted ICC jurisdiction, so maybe they're not a signatory, they haven't ratified the Rome Statute, but they were accepting jurisdiction, that is a way to establish ICC jurisdiction, and then a UNSC referral from the Security Council. At the start of the war, this is how the ICC established its jurisdiction. Ukraine acceded to ICC jurisdiction, asked them to come in and investigate. Since then, at the tail end of 2024, coming into the beginning of 2025, Ukraine ratified the Rome Statute. So it had signed the Rome Statute going back to the early 2000s, but the ratification of it was held up for a number of reasons. It finally ratified. It became the 125th state party to the Rome Statute. Interestingly, it ratified with a caveat that the ICC not have jurisdiction over crimes committed by Ukrainian nationals inside its territory for 7 years. That's a point of controversy. The article that they hinged that caveat on was supposed to be deleted from the Rome Statute. That deletion wasn't effectuated, so that's going to be undoubtedly contested. So you see an evolution here just in the matter of how the ICC establishes its jurisdiction. And this is critical because the ICC has been active. We see not 2 years ago, the ICC issue or 3 years ago now, issue arrest warrants, significant ones, against political leaders. President Putin in Russia and one of his top advisors. The ICC is actively on ground investigating these things. So these questions of jurisdiction, what the ICC can do, what crimes it can investigate, are all critical. Those, to the extent that any of these cases see the inside of an ICC courtroom at some point in the future, that jurisdictional question, hey, can the ICC investigate? Do they have jurisdiction over me as a defendant? Those are going to be hotly contested. Those will have to be litigated before any trial of the facts ever occurs. So keep an eye out for that into the future. In the meantime, domestic prosecutions of IHL violations have proceeded at a fairly significant pace within Ukraine. Again, I can't speak to the prevalence of domestic prosecutions of war crimes within Russian domestic courts. There have been some reports in the breakaway provinces in Ukraine, those occupied territories, there have been some trials there. There's very little transparency into those. It's difficult to get accurate reporting. But within Ukraine, this is a great example of the role that domestic criminal law plays when it comes to IHL violations. Because something like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that's effectively a court of last resort. The international structure is meant not so that crimes are first heard by a body like the ICC, but the international community wants a nation, they want a party empowered to take first line action on these crimes within their own system. Here in the US, that might look like a federal prosecution by the Department of Justice. Ukraine has elements of the Geneva Conventions incorporated within its domestic criminal code. And so those violations have been charged historically up to this point as violations of Ukrainian law. You see the same in the United States criminal code. If you open the USC, there are provisions within the USC that encompass grave breaches to the Geneva Conventions. You'll see the same language from the Geneva Conventions ported over and made into a domestic statute here. And so the legal theory is that a Russian soldier can be prosecuted in Ukrainian court for breaking Ukrainian law. They don't have that combatant immunity because they violated IHL. And the crime that they are being prosecuted for is reflected in Ukrainian criminal law. So Igor Shishmarin, this is the first case that is pictured here. This happened in July of 2022. The prosecution, he ended up pleading guilty, was sentenced to a number of years in prison. And there have been about 80 or so prosecutions domestically. Understandably, the ratio of completed prosecutions to cases under investigation is way out of whack. For every one case that's been prosecuted successfully to conclusion, there are probably 15 to 20,000 that remain under investigation. And so, understandably, this is a question of resources, of an ability to identify the perpetrator. Simply because a crime is under investigation doesn't presume that you'll be able to identify who did it, where that person is, or the ability of the court or authorities to reach that person. You have seen a limited number of these domestic prosecutions that have tried defendants in absentia. So the defendant is not in Ukrainian custody, but nevertheless, the trial moves forward without the defendant there. Those cases, it's great that they go forward, but trials in absentia are naturally problematic. The defendant is not physically present to answer, the verdict. So whatever is handed down, the prison sentence can't be effectuated. That's frustrating to individuals, to victims, to survivors, etc. At the same time, from the defendant's perspective, they're not there to defend themselves, to get due process, to enjoy the due process that a domestic criminal trial would enshrine. Even someone like Shishmarin, in the early days of the war, as the invasion is still sort of hotly contested, things have not settled down when this prosecution happened. This Russian soldier is still provided a defense counsel. He's still empowered to put on a defense, to be advised of the effects of his guilty plea, and then to appeal the sentence that's handed down to the court. And significantly, that was done here. He appealed the sentence that was handed down by the court, arguing that they misapplied elements of IHL, that had they correctly applied certain elements of IHL, that at best he would have received a much lower prison sentence, or a much lower prison sentence would have been warranted in the case. So that due process is critical to counterbalance the system as well. And that's simply not achievable if a defendant isn't sitting in the courtroom to be able to do. So significant challenges remain for domestic prosecutions. Significant questions remain as to what accountability looks like post-war. That will no doubt be influenced by how the war concludes. Under what terms is the conflict resolved? Things will look a lot different if Ukraine somehow collapses, outright loses the war, Russia effectuates its invasion and control of the territory, versus a ceasefire stalemate in which both sides carve out territory, versus total Ukrainian victory. I mean, how things play out, what the international support is for a particular set of war crimes accountability looks different in all three of those scenarios. Ukraine, for its part, has called for the establishment of a post-war international tribunal to be set up. But again, that will take years to effectuate or to wind out in the international community. So much work remains to be done. That can be understandably frustrating, but understand that IHL, regardless of what happens in the accountability space, IHL applies. And both parties in this conflict owe an ongoing obligation to respect and adhere to those principles, no matter how the conflict evolves, no matter how the technology, the weaponry of the conflict evolve as well.